Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In this week's episode, we're talking about Axios and how it tries to design a content experience that's different from anything else you find on the web. There are few people as knowledgeable about web publishing as Scott Rosenberg. In 1995, he and a group of other San Francisco Examiner journalists launched Salon.com, one of the first online magazines. An early blogger, he wrote the definitive history of the blogosphere and published it as a book in 2009. Today, Rosenberg is the tech editor for Axios, a website launched in 2017 by Politico founders Mike Allen and Jim VandeHei. Since its debut, Axios has tried to upend the paradigm for how news can be delivered. Instead of adhering to the structure of the traditional news article, Axios reporters strive for succinctness by delivering information in a bulleted, just-the-facts-ma'am form. As co-founder Jim VandeHei explained in a 2017 interview, quote, 90% of stories either shouldn't have been written or should have been 10% the length. Most people do not want to spend 5 minutes on 1,500 words of mediocrity on something that is one interesting fact, figure, or quote, end quote. In my interview with Scott Rosenberg, he told me about Salon's first viral story and explained why the online magazine was way ahead of its time in both the way it delivered news and how it monetized content. We also discuss Axios' approach to news gathering and whether its Be Smart tagline is patronizing or enlightening. Let's jump right into it. Hey Scott, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So your history in web publishing, it goes back further than most of the people I have on this podcast. You were actually one of the founders of Salon.com, which I think of as being one of the first high-profile internet magazine right alongside Slate. What did Salon look like in those early days?
It was, we called ourselves a web magazine. At the time, that seemed like the best description for what we were trying to do. The only other publisher who was online then was in a significant way was Wired. We actually beat Slate by about 6 months.
Yeah.
And the website was updated every week, which is kind of hard to imagine today. And we saw it as just this blank, I hesitate to use the word since it was our competitors, but a blank slate, a kind of opportunity for us to take what we liked best about journalism as it stood and throw away the stuff we didn't like and try out lots of new things. And what we didn't realize was how primitive the technology was and how limiting it would be at the beginning, which it really was.
Yeah, and did it feel radical like what you guys were doing? Because I don't even know if the New York Times had a website back then.
It did. But it was not. It was basically a place to show some of the print content. It didn't. It felt like there was a radicalness simply in the self-determined nature of what we were doing. The radicalness for us, we were a bunch of newspaper journalists from the San Francisco Examiner, who I think all of us felt just reveled in our independence and the fact that we could make decisions about coverage ourselves, that we didn't have a bureaucracy around us. What I now look back and realize, we were a startup. How exciting. At the time, we didn't even have that vocabulary. I mean, we knew what a tech startup was, but we hadn't sort of crossed that line and thought of ourselves as doing something similar in journalism. It was more primitive than that.
And was it like, did you guys get investors? Was it completely bootstrapped? And did it just look like a traditional magazine where you were just commissioning long form pieces? What was the approach that way?
There were investors at the very beginning. Our first grant was like a seed grant from Apple, of all places. And Apple was going to be our first big investor. This was pre, the return of Steve Jobs. And they backed out, and Adobe was our big investor, a $2 million investment they made.
Wow.
that's that got us going. And yes, we were very. I mean, if you look at our editorial structure, it was very much like a weekly magazine, commissioning freelancers, editing the stories, posting them all like once a week, and then almost immediately we realized, oh, this is like crazy. Our traffic is huge the day we post things, and then it drops to nothing. Uh, we need to be publishing new stuff every day. So we switched part of our cycle to that pretty quickly. Within a year, we were publishing daily instead of weekly, daily with updates throughout the day. I was always campaigning for us to give up the idea of issues entirely. That was an issue was a relic of of the print paradigm, and we needed to stop thinking that way. It took us about 4 years to get there, but we did.
And what did you publish that was like, did anything like make a big splash back then? Like I'm thinking of, that era of web publishing. I
Yeah.
know the Stephen Glass expose was at some kind of web publication. I forget if it was like Forbes Online or something like that.
The
Was there anything that would like you guys were really able to get like insert yourself into the kind of media zeitgeist back then?
so the biggest splash, I mean, it wasn't in 95, 96, we could get coverage just for being what we were, which was like something on the web that traditional media reporters could get their heads around and understand. And that helped us a lot. But the first story we did that made a national splash, and that made, I think, a difference in the political world, was the Henry Hyde story in 1999, I guess it was. It was, no one. It's ancient history now, but at the time, this was the last presidential impeachment, the previous one.
Mm-hmm.
And Henry Hyde was the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and his committee was about to vote on impeaching Bill Clinton for lying about adultery, and or lying about sexual misconduct, I guess is actually the more precise way to put it. And this guy came to us at Salon and had this documentary proof that Henry Hyde had an affair with his wife, and it had been hushed up through the years. It was sort of something that had happened. I forget how long ago, but it was old news. Except it suddenly was relevant again, and uh, this gentleman had taken the story to, I don't know, like 50 news outlets, he claimed, and no one would publish it. Everyone thought, well, this is old news and it's smearing Henry Hyde, and why should we do this? And we looked at the story and thought, if this guy is the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee and about to do this, maybe the American people should know this about his past. And we published the story, and we took a lot of heat for it. A lot of people in journalism thought we stepped over the line. I think, in retrospect, if you imagine this happening today, like 50 outlets would be fighting for this story today. So that story definitely put us on the map. It also, made us a lot of enemies. But I think historically, I'll stand by that decision, and I think the record is on our side.
What was it like back then for a story to go quote unquote viral? Like, was it a completely different? I'm guessing it was a much smaller phenomenon than it is today. Like, what, I don't know. How did that change or what did you see some like spike in the website traffic, or
Yeah,
was most of it
yeah.
you covered?
You could see the spike in the traffic. I mean, in at that point, we were getting daily traffic reports, so it wasn't like a real time. Chartbeat didn't exist. Um, but the vector for the story going viral, of course, this was pre Facebook and kind of pre Google. So the main vector then was Drudge, and that's like something that is hilarious to think that is still a part of our landscape today. Drudge picked it up, and then immediately broadcast. It went straight from, once we published the story on Salon on the web. Um, the floodgates opened, and of course all the TV stations could then go in and say, well, we didn't report this, but this sort of shady website called Salon published it, and we're just reporting what they published, that Henry Hyde has this problem in his past. Um, and so it was kind of straight from the web to TV without the intermediate step that we have today of Twitter and Facebook and going viral socially.
I seem to remember, so I think I became aware of Salon like somewhere in the mid to early 2000s. I seem to remember it being a subscription-based publisher that slowly became a free publication. I remember they rolled out this innovative product that I actually thought, to this day, I'm surprised other publications haven't tried it, where you had to pay, but if you watched like a 30-second video ad, then you could get a free day's pass to it, which I thought was really innovative because, yes, it was giving you free stuff for an ad, but it made you pay attention to the ad. And it seems like that would be really valuable to an advertiser. Like, do you feel like, so was it always a subscription publication from the beginning, or was there like an
No,
app?
no.
What was kind of the evolution there?
So Slate was the big experimenter with
Mm-hmm.
subscriptions. Slate was backed by Microsoft, and they with the express goal of proving that you could create subscription-worthy content online. They did it for a year, and it was a disaster, and they pulled back. We were always proudly free, and went public in 1999. We had an IPO, and that was all great until the dot-com bust. And when that happened, we, financially, we were in big trouble. And we were one of the first, if not the first, major online publisher to do what we now call a limited uh, gate.
Like a freemium model.
What is the, yeah. So we rolled out a subscription plan. We said, you can pay. The controversial thing we did was we said, if you pay to subscribe, we'll take the ads off
Yeah,
the
which
site.
Talking Points Memo does today. Like this is like
Yes.
the model that several publishers
Yeah.
today are thriving under.
So I feel like in the first 8 years or so of Salon's history, we explored every possible version of an online publishing business model. We did affiliates. We did like Amazon kickbacks on product sales. We did membership program, subscriptions, modified subscriptions, subscription with the ads removed. Eventually, the thing that actually was most successful for us was the membership program, where it wasn't even. I mean, I think you got the ads removed, but the main thing was during the Iraq War run-up, we were one of the few media outlets that was pretty clearly opposed to the Iraq War from the beginning. And if you recall that era, it was a time when um, the a lot of the media was very heavily, post 9/11. Let's not question the president. Let's not question the intelligence. The New York Times was running, some pretty dodgy stories that it later had to essentially, withdraw. And we found that we at the peak, I think we had 80,000 subscribers in like 2003, 2004, who were essentially paying because they just wanted to support the journalism we were doing.
80,000. Wow,
Uh,
that's a
yeah.
lot.
And that was, we actually started breaking even in around then, 2004, 2005. And that was I think our most successful business model version. It was, it's a surprise, here we are, 15 years later. But back then, I think that was the beginning of what we now see in full flower of essentially partisan based uh, media identification, and people being willing to pay to support news that is coming to them from people whose perspectives the readers
It
trust.
feels like Salon was a little bit too early to the game in a lot of respects. Like, you look at some of the models it was trying out then, and now there are publications that are seeing a lot of success with that. Like, it used to publish really high quality journalism, and they probably flash forward 20 years, like, a lot of publications like the New Yorker, New York Times are really seeing a lot of success selling subscriptions. I know you don't work there anymore, but it seems to have become a kind of a clickbaity far left publication. Do you recognize anything from the old Salon when you look at its current day incarnation?
There's I think a couple people there who I worked with years ago, including Mary Elizabeth Williams and Andrew O'Hare. And there's still, I think, some talented people contributing, but I don't, visit it regularly at this point. And, I don't, I think it's a shadow of what it used to be. Um, it was early. I mean, the advantage of being early is you have a lot of freedom and you learn a lot. And it's the excitement is hard to beat. The disadvantage is that nothing is proven. And particularly on the business side, you just make a lot of mistakes.
After you left Salon, you wrote this book about the history of the blogosphere. It's called Say Anything. It was published in 2000.
Say,
Oh, sorry.
I have to interrupt you. It's called
Say
Say
Everything.
Everything.
Okay, Say Everything. It was, I think, published in 2009, which was near the tail
Yeah.
end of what we kind of think of as the golden age of blogging. Now that it's more than 10 years later after the publication, are you surprised by how far away we've moved from that decentralized web?
I'm a little surprised. I mean, I think when I published Say Everything was sort of right at the moment that people were beginning to think, social media may really be replacing blogs as a kind of the fundamental way that individuals express themselves online. And uh, what I am disappointed by and a little surprised by is how total that transformation was, and how few people have stuck with the sort of personal, you know, uh, independent blog as a model, including myself. I mean, I stopped blogging because I needed to earn a living as a journalist, and that was never how I imagined myself earning a living as a journalist. And you know, uh, and also because the part of the what worked in blogging was the cross blog kind of conversation, and that's a collective failure. But once it's gone, it's gone. You know.
What about kind of like the indie newsletter and podcast scene? Like, some people have pointed out that feels the closest facsimile of that old school blogosphere, of that kind of more informal content creation that doesn't adhere to kind of what you think of as like traditional media. Do you get that
Yeah.
feeling at all? Like, are you encouraged by the rise of like companies like Substack, and the kind of cool niche stuff that's popping up there?
Yeah, I think anything that helps, individual journalists, artists, creators do their work and reach people and earn money if that's what they want to do is great. And the email newsletters and podcasts that people are making, are definitely a lot of them in the spirit of blogging. The forms are very different and miss a lot of the qualities that blogging had. Specifically, I mean, podcasts, audio is just a whole different thing. People who love it for good reason. But I'm kind of a writer and a words on the screen, words on the page kind of person, and I don't have the hours to listen to podcasts, and I consume written media much more efficiently. So for me personally, they don't fill the same role. Email does, and email newsletters are great, but they are very they don't have that networked feeling that you had with. I mean, when you did a blog post and comments before comments became kind of this polluted spam filled kind of problem, you had this beautiful hybrid of personal writing and online conversation. And you don't get that in an email
Yeah,
newsletter.
although I don't know how much you've looked at Substack, is I think that's kind of how they were really innovative. Is they made a newsletter platform that is also a very pretty publishing platform. And I study a lot because I have a Substack myself. I study some of
Mm-hmm.
the other ones, and some of them have very vibrant comment sections. And they have this product called Threads, which are almost like message boards where you can like launch a discussion thread and stuff like that. It does sometimes feel like it does feel like that a little bit like that kind of old school blogosphere when I'm
Cool.
looking at some of
Yeah.
that stuff. So you're the tech editor at Axios now. How did that come about? Did they pursue you?
It was, I think, a mutual thing. I had this job working with the amazing Stephen Levy at Back Channel and Wired, and it was a short term kind of fill in thing, and Back Channel wound up being essentially rolled back into Wired proper, and there was no job for me there. So I needed to find work, and Axios was looking, and I met with them, and they liked me, and I liked them, and that was that.
So what was the pitch that you would be you would run the tech coverage you would run that team?
Well, so when I joined, I was working with an amazing editor named Kim Hart, who was the sort of founding tech editor at Axios. And she was sort of running the tech coverage out of Washington, which is where Axios's home base is. And Ina Fried was writing the tech newsletter out here in the Bay Area. And they specifically wanted a tech editor based in the West Coast for time zone reasons and for industry knowledge reasons. And so that really appealed to me because I'm committed to living in the Bay Area where I've been for 25 years, didn't want to move. Um, and so my original mandate was to edit Ina's work and to help Axios kind of bring some more further industry knowledge and awareness, and all the whatever expertise I have from my now veteran status as a technology journalist, and and to work with Kim and the other folks in DC. We have an amazing media reporter named Sarah Fisher. And then I was also working with David McCabe, who covered Capitol Hill. He's since moved on to the New York Times. We lost him, but now we have Margaret McGill, who we hired, who's also a great reporter. So it's kind of, I mean, for me, the appeal was to work with in a kind of exciting startup newsroom again, because that's really what Axios is. I mean, it's a startup that has kind of answered some of the financial questions that we were trying to answer at Salon a lot better than we ever did at Salon, and to experiment with online forums. I mean, the Axios forum, as you know, is very oriented towards mobile consumption, which is how people get their news today, and figuring out how can you deliver trustworthy, smart coverage in a way that doesn't oversimplify the news, but that people are willing to actually read on their phones. That's the problem that we set out to solve at Axios, and I think are making some good headway with.
So you've worked for a few media companies. Does it feel unique in some way? Like if you listen to interviews with like Mike Allen or Jim VandeHei, they pitch it kind of like we're covering the news differently. We're just the facts. We realize that like the traditional AP inverted pyramid style article was outdated. I mean, do you kind of buy into that? Do you feel like, does it feel different than the way that you guys cover stuff than compared to, your competitors?
Yeah, there are differences and similarities. I mean, the thing that's kind of at the core is a very, strong culture of verification and of not publishing stuff till we're absolutely sure of it, and not just jumping on, rumors. There's a lot of that built into our kind of, routines and processes. So that's kind of a starting point. What's different is that there's I think a willingness to say, you know what, this particular story is not worth covering. We're pretty selective. Our teams are small, and I think that's by design. We're not trying to be comprehensive. We're trying to say, you know, if this thing happens on Capitol Hill but isn't going to ultimately lead to anything, do our readers need to know it? If Facebook issued an announcement today, but the announcement really doesn't change anything, like, why should we cover that? So there's a stronger filter, and there's a willingness to say, you know what, this story is something readers probably ought to know about, but we can tell it to them in 2 paragraphs. They really don't need the 1,000 words, and we're not going to just like fill the 1,000 words because that's how we do it,
I know.
and that is refreshing to
I,
me.
I guess my one pushback on it is like sometimes I'm reading an Axios story and the succinctness of it feels almost artificial. Like
Hmm.
I want to go deeper on the subject, but it feels like the writer just felt obligated to keep it short. I don't know.
Hmm.
Do you feel like
Yeah.
as the editor and a writer, like you have this ethos where it's like I need to keep this under 500 words, so I need to throw all this stuff out just to get it to that length?
Um,
Would you guys ever publish like a 3,000 word
so
deep dive? Do you guys do that?
uh, we have done what we call deep dives that are probably in total, I don't know, about 3,000 words, but certainly 2,000 words. And they're like a bunch of shorter stories all on the same theme or topic. So there's a cumulative kind of depth to that. But the other way to think about it, I mean, as an editor, when I go through and make choices to cut things, uh, I've never felt like, oh, I went too far, or, gee, a reader, I'm leaving a reader in the dark about something important. So that's one thing. But another thing is, um, think about coverage as cumulative, and think about what links allow you to do. We literally have a link at the end of, I'd say, the majority of our stories that says go deeper.
Uh-huh.
And that is a link. Either sometimes they're to other Axios stories that are more like explainers or background or the previous story in a chain of events. And sometimes they're to stories in other publications. I mean, I just did a piece about the Huawei controversy, and the best story about it was a 3,000 word piece in Wired that Garrett Graff wrote. I linked to that. So we try to provide that depth for a reader who wants it, who wants to get it. But I'm sure that sometimes a short story will leave someone hungry, and if we haven't given them that, if we've failed to put that kind of link on, or if we just I'm sure there are times when we don't get that right,
Mm-hmm.
because we're doing daily journalism, and you never get it completely right. But I think it's a service to readers, for whom too often today the real choice is, like, not the Axios version of the story or the longer version, but the Axios version of the story or nothing at all. Because the longer version too often for all of us winds up in an unread tab that you leave around forever and that eventually disappears the next time your browser crashes and you don't recover it.
Yeah. I also like sometimes I'm not sure who the Axios reader is supposed to be because when I'm landing on it, it's usually something I intensely care about, like something within media or tech or something like that. But then there's like these things like why this matters or get smart, where it's saying something like that part like is really obvious, like you're like almost like you're talking to this like low information
Hmm.
news consumer. I don't know, what do you get the sense of the readership being? Because I feel like a lot of people who subscribe to like the Axios login or the media newsletter, like they're people who work in the industry. I don't know, is there any ever kind of and I don't know, I guess it just feels
Yeah.
I don't know. It feels like there's something patronizing going on by
Hmm.
telling me to get smart on something that I kind of, like, I know why this story is important. And you guys are actually breaking legitimate news. So I'm not saying that you're not providing good information. It's just like, it's weird messaging to say get smart or why this matters sometimes. Who do you
Hmm.
get the sense to
Yeah.
be,
Well,
who the reader is?
yeah. I mean, certainly we don't ever want people to feel patronized, and if that's happening, we're obviously doing something wrong. I think the readership challenge, the readership definition is, at any publication I've ever worked at, has been, an ever changing target. At Axios, I think the starting target was, sort of the readers of Mike Allen's newsletter, which is very much a DC insider kind of crowd. But from the very beginning at Axios, the ambition that Jim and Mike had, since they weren't just recreating Politico, was to cast a much wider net and to reach many more people. And so the question is for us every day is defining, what is it that people really know about this subject? For us in the tech coverage in particular, what we're doing at Axios is kind of connecting people who are in the industry out here on the West Coast or in other places, and people in DC policy circles, people who follow, the legislator and the regulatory agencies, and to try to explain those two worlds to each other, essentially. And so sometimes we'll put in an explanation of something in the tech world that everybody in the tech world knows, but that a lot of people in DC don't know. And vice versa. We'll have to explain some intricacy of the way the FCC works that a lot of people in DC know already, but that nobody in Silicon Valley really knows. So we're doing a bit of a dance there. I'm sure sometimes we miscalculate. I would prefer, as an editor, and as a journalist, to miscalculate on the side of over explaining things, because I think too often journalists are still writing for one another, and Twitter kind of, accentuates that, and we're always sort of assuming that people know things that they really don't know. And so I'd rather err on the side of over explaining, and if we can do that without adopting a patronizing tone, even better. Maybe that's just a matter of the phrasing of some of those headers that we use, and be smart maybe is something that, we should look at closely about how people perceive that.
Uh-huh. So I kind of think of Axios as a newsletter first company that also happens to have a web presence. Like, do you feel like it has a newsletter mentality? Like you were talking before about how it's kind of designed to be read on mobile. What's kind of the thinking there that you feel like makes it different than, just, name New York Times, TechCrunch, whatever?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely. I think newsletter first has been where, it's where Axios started, and we definitely think of the newsletters till now as our kind of primary product, and the website is important because it's where a lot of people find, our stories and find our newsletters, but we put stuff very often into the newsletters first. Um, and they're also kind of one of the foundations of the business model. So that's a starting point. However, we do have, I don't think it's a secret that we've been developing an app, and that app is, I think, going to go into a public beta pretty soon now. You know, and that's going to be a little bit of a different twist on the newsletter kind of model. And I think there'll be some interesting innovations that you'll see there. And of course, there's also that we haven't mentioned the TV stuff we do. So we have this HBO program that's been a huge factor in getting the word out about what we do. And that points people both to the newsletters and to the website. So there's hopefully some, kind of cross promotion there that's healthy for the work we're doing. I mean, all of that, I think, it feels to me like it's unique. It's different from what, the sort of new model media company as of 10 years ago or 8 years ago was BuzzFeed or Vox. And, they both have done exciting, interesting things, but I think what we're doing is different.
Well, like, are the metrics you're judged by different from what editors at those other publications are judged by? Like, is there a greater emphasis on newsletter signups versus web visits?
Honestly, I personally am not a big believer in incentivizing journalists with metrics. I think it's good for us to know what's happening in our businesses, but the moment you start to give journalists business goals, you're kind of like setting them up for failure, because I, as a newsletter writer, do not have my hands on a marketing budget. So, like, why should I be responsible for subscription numbers? So we don't do that. That we don't have those kinds of goals for our individual journalists. I can't. I don't know if. I mean, does BuzzFeed? Does Vox? I don't know. If they do, I think that's a mistake.
So I know when Axios first launched, there was this talk of a $10,000 a year subscription product, but it hasn't launched yet. I think they've been kind of cagey on whether it will ever launch. Like, is that still on the product horizon? Are you thinking about what is something that could, like, what kind of cover, how would that coverage be differentiated so that it was worth subscribing to? Where does that fit in at all?
I can't even tell you, because I've never heard of a $10,000 a year product. If there's one being cooked up, it could be happening, but I don't know anything about it.
Interesting. So it sounds like, from based on what you're saying, and also just what I've heard from interviews with them, is like they just have been surprised by how successful an advertising focused model has been, and seems like it seems to be working for you guys.
I think that's true. I think that there are other efforts underway on the business side that I can't talk about, because I'm not, like, A, I don't know enough about them, and B, they're not, like, ready to be talked about, mm-hmm. as far as I know. So I don't think you should draw a conclusion that Axios is simply saying, hey, the newsletter sponsorship model is fine and we're done, because I don't think that's the case. Mm-hmm. There are other things underway, but I'm not the person to talk about that.
Are you guys doing anything in, like, events or podcasting currently, like your team?
My team, Axios overall has an events program, and Ina is, as you know, an amazing kind of public speaker and moderator, and is out there a whole lot. She just got back from Davos, where she did a panel. So we're out there a lot with events. I don't know that I mean, I don't have any announcements to make about any new efforts there. Mm-hmm. Podcasts, we have Dan Primack does an amazing daily podcast. Again, it's very Axios style. It's like 5 or 10 minutes long. It's not an hour. And that's been very successful. I know that everyone at Axios is excited about exploring, other podcasts and other possibilities. And you may well hear more from us this year on that.
Awesome. Well, those were all the questions I had. Where can people find more of your work online?
Well, my personal website is at wordyard.com, and Axios is where my writing is now all the time.
Awesome. Well, this was a lot of fun. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast, so if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.